You have heard it said that you ought to love the Lord your God with all of your heart, mind, and strength, and you should love your neighbor as you love yourself. And you have heard it said that you ought to love and pray for your enemies. But I am here to tell you, sisters and brothers, on this good day, loving God and neighbor and self and enemy is not enough. We ought to love our frenemies. Because as Christian essayist and thinker G.K. Chesterton has said, we ought to love our neighbors and our enemies because often they end up being the same person. Or it's because the relationships that we have with our frenemies deserve our love. Now, frenemy came into the English language in 1953 in a column by gossip columnist Walter Winchell. How many of you remember Walter Winchell? There you go. He used it in an article describing the very unique relationship between the United States of America and the USSR, and recognizing the unique state of affairs between the 20th century superpowers. Winchell said, "How's about calling the Russians our frenemies?" And that was the first time that the word frenemy had been used in print literature. Then it pops up again in the early 2000s. In 2000, in an episode of Sex and the City, Samantha goes on a rant about her rivals. And she says that she often has needed a good close friend and a bitter enemy in her life to get by. And often each has coincided in the same person. Then in 2007, Stephen Colbert dedicates The Word, that segment, The Word, to the word frenemy. And he does this whole bit about how China has replaced the USSR as our frenemy. And they are our frenemy because, well, China is a totalitarian state that supports tyrannical dictators and sells weapons. So, they're our enemy. But they also loan the United States a lot of money when we can't go without buying that new 62-inch LED television, which they probably made pretty cheap and shipped to the United States even cheaper. So, they're our friend. So thanks, China. You've been such a good frenemy, according to Stephen Colbert. So what is a frenemy? Well, according to Webster's dictionary, that's right. In 2010, frenemy entered into the official dictionary, Webster's, and it is said to be an oxymoron and a portmanteau of friend and enemy that refers to a person who is friendly despite fundamental dislikes or rivalry, or a person who combines the characteristics of a friend and enemy. And literature and pop culture are rife with amazing and wonderful examples of frenemies. Hamlet and Laertes, Eleanor Dashwood and Lucy Steele, Vladimir and Estragon, Betty and Veronica, Catwoman and Batman, Homer Simpson and Ned Flanders, Woody and Buzz Aldrin, or Buzz Lightyear. Buzz Aldrin. I don't know if Buzz Aldrin and got along with those guys. I wonder if he was frenemies with the guys on the Apollo 11. And right now, I bet you're starting to go through your list of friends and colleagues and neighbors, family members, starting to think, who is your frenemy? Y'all are going through that list, doing that calculus. Are they on the friend list, or the enemy list, or the frenemy list? I was at this conference this past week in Fort Worth at Bright Divinity School, and I got a chance to see a lot of old classmates and professors and old friends and even a few frenemies as well. It's almost a reunion more than it's a conference these days, and the preaching was on fire. The Reverend Dr. Frederick Douglass Haynes III just brought it from the pulpit every single night, and I sat through some amazing workshops that I'll be processing and digesting for the next couple of weeks. And as I was there, my friends and stuff were sitting around a table, and we're discussing the sermons that we're going to be preaching when we get back to our collective in individual congregations. And my friend, the Reverend Dr. Dan DeLeon, who many of you have heard about, he's the pastor at Friends Congregational Church in Bryan College Station, said to me when I told him that I was going to be preaching on Love Your Frenemy, he said, that's great because the church is full of frenemies. So as you're going through your calculus of friends and neighbors and family members, your frenemy may be sitting next to you in the pew. Think about it, Dan said. More than half the population of church attendees and active members are women. And the church and women have been frenemies from the very start. For every Miriam and Mary and Magdalene, for every Phoebe who preached the gospel and Lydia who financed Paul's mission, there is the throwing of Eve underneath a bus. There is the rape of Dinah and Bathsheba. There's the subjugating of women to the margins by household codes that became church doctrine and dogma. And yet, if it had not been for women in every congregation from the very beginning of time that the church became a thing, our communities would have fallen apart like a delicate plate thrown on a hard floor. But it's not a hard floor that women are concerned with. It's the hard ceiling when it comes to church leadership positions given to women that they deserve and have every ounce of ability and capability and gifts to do. We forget that it's only been 200 years since the Protestant church has begun to formally ordain women, and that is only 1/4 of all of Christendom. Catholicism and Orthodoxy still has not jumped onto that ship. So for every affirmation of marks of ministry and the gifts and talents and calling of women through the years, there is still this overwhelming stereotype in the Christian church that says, a man can just do it better. And to that, we all want to go, "Bleh." I almost said a naughty word. Women and the church have been historic frenemies. And we are hopeful that a time has come where we will end the enemy part of that and just become friends. And our sacred story this morning gives us an analogous example of how that relationship between the church and women can be repaired and move forward in the frenemy relationship between Jesus and the Pharisees. In the story, Jesus has just been doing his Jesus thing, preaching and healing, doing miracles. In exorcisms, he's gone up onto a mountaintop. He has been transfigured. He has come down with a blessing from God, and now his gaze is fixed upon Jerusalem, that journey in which we will start walking with him on this coming Wednesday for the next 46 days. And his popularity and his prestige is at an all-time high, and because of that, Herod Antipas, that king in a certain part of Judea, desires to have an audience with Jesus. But Jesus sees Herod for what he is, a fox in the henhouse, and he denies the wish of Herod that he come to Herod and put on a show. Because for Herod, Jesus is a sideshow. He is a carny act, but we know better. And when Herod, like a child throwing a temper tantrum in the middle of a store aisle, because his mom would not allow him to buy Fruity Pebbles. That's a throwback to last week's sermon if you're paying attention. But he is like a child with power and money and a police department. And he conspires to kill Jesus. And who comes to warn Jesus like a good frenemy should? The good old Pharisees. And I know what you're thinking. I thought that the Pharisees weren't frenemies, but enemies. That's what 2,000 years of Christian anti-Semitism and bad scholarship has taught us. Amen. Thank you. I even read, preparing for the sermon today, a 16th century commentary on this very passage that said the reason why the Pharisees are helping Jesus out is because they are trying to entrap him. When someone does something kind and good and it's painted as something bad because they are Jewish, that is called anti-Semitism. And that has been the way that the church has looked at the Pharisees for 2,000 years, and that time needs to come to an end. Sure, Some Pharisees strongly disagreed with Jesus over the interpretations of the law that Jesus was preaching. Some of them disagreed with him over the importance of the law. But Luke, unlike the Gospels of Matthew, Mark, and John, does not totally paint the Pharisees in an unfavorable light. And according to the Reverend Dr. Frederick Craddock, that great godfather of 20th century narrative preaching, a fine man who we all preach, rest in peace, Dr. Craddock, he says in his commentary on the Gospel of Luke that Luke mostly presents the Pharisees as moderate voices on the Jewish council, colleagues with Jesus, who often invite him to dinner. How many of you would invite someone who you dislike that much to dinner over and over again? The Pharisees were constantly inviting Jesus to dinner, sharing meals with him, breaking bread with him, putting a place around their table for them. And when they did debate with him, they have some pretty good points. We ought to wash our hands before we eat. And we ought to take a break from work and actually have a true Sabbath. Those are the points the Pharisees are making. And yet we think that if a person says that we should wash our hands before we eat or that we should take a break from work and we paint that in a bad light because they are Jewish, that is called, sisters and brothers, anti-Semitism. And it's been the practice of the church for 2,000 years. We forget that Nicodemus, one of the earliest followers of Christ, was a Pharisee. And Luke even tells in the sequel to the Gospel of Luke, in the book of Acts, that Paul, the person who brought the good news to Luke himself, describes himself near the close of Paul's ministry. Not I was a Pharisee, but I quote from the book of Acts, I am a Pharisee. Now you might be thinking to yourself, Daryl, this is all very fascinating. If I am ever on Jeopardy, this will come in really handy. But where is the good news? Well, if we were simply going to end the sermon here, and the fact that all we did this morning was call out 2,000 years of Christian anti-Semitism, that in and of itself is good news. So that we can overcome it and we can stop it. But there's more. If we look closely, we can discern good news in this story by the very hand of God, that a frenemy is guided onto Christ's path and into Christ's life just when he needs it the most, just when he least expects it. God has a way of moving people into our lives just at our time of need. And sometimes those people are not friends or enemies, they are our frenemies. So why should we love our frenemies, sisters and brothers? Because you have heard it said that we ought to love our God with all of our heart, mind, and strength, and we ought to love our neighbors as we love ourselves. And you have heard it said that we ought to love and pray for our enemies. But I am here to tell you, sisters and brothers, that God, neighbors, self, and enemies are not enough. We ought to love our frenemies. We need to love our frenemies because they are too children of God, made in the image of God, blessed to be very good by God, just like everyone else on this planet. And they deserve our love just for that. But we also ought to love them because we ought to be grateful for our frenemies, because sometimes God puts them in our lives in crucial moments to help us out in ways that friends and enemies will not or cannot. Did Jesus' disciples, his closest friends and companions, not hear the rumors that Herod was trying to kill him? They had just been out on mission, circulating through the Galilean countryside. They didn't hear a peep. They had been in the midst of the crowds for months. They didn't hear a word about this. They didn't get a whiff. I find that hard to believe. What I do not find hard to believe, and what I find very plausible, are Jesus' closest friends and companions don't know how to tell him this. How many of you have had hard news to tell a friend and you have no idea how you're going to do it? And so instead of sharing hard news with someone, we sit on our hands because we don't want to hurt their feelings, we don't want to scare them, we don't want to give them the bad, hard news. So we don't know how to say it, so we don't ever say it. And by this point in the story, Jesus' enemies are starting to plot against him. So why would they try to prevent anything that Herod is trying to do, which they want to do themselves? Because they're enemies. But the Pharisees, they might have disagreements with Jesus. They might not agree with him on every single aspect of his ministry, but they respect him, and they seem to like him. They maybe even love him. And it's only 2,000 years of Christian anti-Semitism which has put the Pharisees in a box that says that they are enemies of Jesus and not something else. It is our biased reading of the Pharisees that makes the Pharisees coming to help Jesus and do him a solid. that makes it sound weird in our ears. It's our clouded vision of God's purposes and not being able to see the hand of God work through this story and to break down labels and boxes that we put people in that deny these folks from doing an amazing thing of kingdom building in the midst of Christ. In August 2017, the Texas State Legislature called a special session to vote on what was being said was going to be budget issues. But as soon as the congressional folk gathered in Austin, it was clear that they were gathering for one reason and one reason only. That fox, the Lieutenant Governor Dan Patrick, wanted to pass a bathroom bill requiring that folks had to use, by law, the bathroom according to the gender that was listed on their birth certificate. In response to this subterfuge and deceit by Lieutenant Governor Dan Patrick, the LGBT community and their allies mobilized a massive lobbying response, which meant that the youth group of Friends Congregational Church and Bryan College Station decided to take it upon themselves to lobby their senators and their district representatives, which led them to the office of Representative John Rainey, Republican, District 14, Bryan College Station. And if you are starting to think to yourself, wait a second, why would a Republican vote against a bathroom bill? Then you've already put Representative Rainey in a box. And you haven't really followed my sermons. I would never put an example in my sermon that ends up being bad, right? Like this. So the youth start doing their spiel, talking about how we're all God's children, we're all loved by God, and we all deserve the same human and civil rights. And Representative Rainey sat there and listened to the kids do their spiel, and after they had finished their prepared remarks, Representative Rainey told them that he was not going to vote for the bathroom bill. He started saying, and he listed off his reasons as, well, it's bad for business, and it will detract from out-of-state investors bringing money into Texas. He also mentioned that it would put a strain on local law enforcement, and it would be almost impossible to enforce. But he said that's not why he's not going to vote for this bathroom bill. He said to the youth, and I quote, "I don't get transgender. I barely get gay. And transgender is just one step too far for me. But I have a friend. I have a colleague whose son came out as transgender. And I saw that the struggle that he, she, they, I don't know what the right pronoun is. And my friend, my colleague's child, lost the struggle because bullies and being afraid. And I'm not going to vote for this bathroom bill because it would make a vulnerable community even more afraid. And I have the opportunity to make people feel safer and to help alleviate their anxiety and their fear. And what kind of person would I be if I didn't take that opportunity? So rest assured, I promise you, I will vote no. Every once in a while, God moves somebody into our path to help us in our time of need. sometimes that person is our friend. Rarely, but every once in a while, even an enemy can be moved by the hand of God. But we ought to love our frenemies, because you have heard it said, sisters and brothers, that we ought to love our God with all of our heart, mind, and strength, and our neighbor as we love ourselves. And you have heard it said that we ought to love and pray for our enemies. But I am here to tell you that we ought to, loving God and neighbor and self and enemy is not enough. If we are to walk in the ways of Christ, we need to love our frenemy as well. Because every once in a while, via the hand of God, they help us in our most crucial moment. And that is something to be thankful for. Praise be to God. Amen.